Welcome. Thank you for being here to take part in a discussion about an issue of incredible importance to all of us at the Charles Koch Institute and indeed to our country. We're here to talk about the urgent opportunity to continue the progress on criminal justice reform so that we can achieve justice, dignity, and public safety. And we're thrilled that you've all decided to join us on this cool morning here in Washington, D.C. If you look around, we expect that these seats will be filled throughout the course of the day. Hundreds of people have decided to join us for a discussion of an issue whose time has come, and I take the response that we've received, not just to this conference, but to all of the conversations that we've hosted over the course of the year, as a sign of the momentum that this issue has gained, in large part, thanks to the efforts of so many of you and so many of the folks who will join us throughout the course of the day. So as we kick things off this morning, I want to start by saying thank you to each one of you for the role that you've played in helping to make this issue of criminal justice reform the urgent national priority that it is today. So thank you. Now, as we'll talk about for the rest of the day, we have a long way to go, and the folks in this room know all too well of the challenges that we face. But as we focus on the challenges, let's not lose sight of the incredible progress that we've made together as a community over the past several years, primarily at the state level, but also with the support of some of the federal lawmakers that we'll hear today, progress that's on the horizon at the federal level. And so we're excited about the opportunities ahead. We're really thrilled that you've all decided to join us for the discussions today, and we're thankful for all of the work that you're doing to help move this issue forward. Now I want to say a word about why the Charles Koch Institute has decided to host this conversation and to focus so much on this issue over the past several years. At the Charles Koch Institute, we are committed to helping individuals across the country to realize their potential. We work to enable folks to live fulfilling and meaningful lives, and we do that not just because it helps to enable personal success for those individuals and their families, but because that's how we move our country forward. It's the culmination of all of those individual successes which ultimately constitutes progress in our country and our society. And the way that we do that, the way that we succeed in this mission, is by working to identify barriers that are holding people back, barriers that are preventing individuals from realizing their American dreams, their potential, and living fulfilling and meaningful lives. So while we address a number of issues at the Charles Koch Institute, we have activities kind of across the board and all over the map, the one thing that ties all of what we do together is this notion of identifying and removing barriers to opportunity so that individuals can chart their own course and find success in their lives. And unfortunately, the barriers that the criminal justice system puts up in front of too many Americans, and especially the least fortunate, remain severe. And so our work to reform a broken criminal justice system is absolutely essential to the role that we play and to our mission at the Charles Koch Institute. It's an issue that many of you know we've been working on for decades, and it's an issue on which we've had many phenomenal partners, and I'm excited to reconnect with many of you who've been partners on this with us for so many years over the course of the day. Now, this is a room that I don't need to remind that the criminal justice system is a complex one. And so one of the roles that we play and that so many of you play is helping to make sure that the difficult decisions that need to be made to reform our criminal justice system are decisions that can be made with the benefit of the very best research, scholarship, and data. And that's why we've been so pleased to support scholars at dozens of universities across the country who are working on the tough issues of what to do about our criminal justice system. People like Professor Eric Luna from Arizona State University, who if you didn't get a chance to meet last night, you'll have a chance to meet later today. This guy's incredible. He's brought together over 100 leading scholars, folks who specialize in different aspects of the challenges in our criminal justice system, to tackle the hard questions to make sure that policymakers have authentic resources based in research and scholarship to help them make these decisions. If you haven't seen this volume yet, it was just released yesterday. It's really exciting. We think it's a breakthrough and can really help to support the work that so many of you are doing to improve the system. And while the details of public policy are the means by which we address the injustices in our system today, we're always focused on why we do what we do, the purpose of our shared efforts. And that's to help enable people to have the chance to live better lives and to succeed on their own terms. And so in addition to welcoming the scholars who are with us today, I want to also say how grateful we are for the partnership of so many of you who are advocating for change on the front lines in the fight to improve our criminal justice system. So thank you all for being here. Because ultimately, we're here to help ensure that people are not judged by the worst mistake that they've ever made, that those who deserve a second chance are given one, that families are not unnecessarily torn apart, that the police receive the respect that comes with enforcing respectable laws, that communities are places of comfort and not division, and that justice is not something that only a few in our country are able to afford. And what's really exciting to us at the Charles Koch Institute is, while we meet here in Washington, D.C., a town where almost every conversation is a partisan conversation, this is not one of those. This issue of the urgent need to improve our criminal justice system is not a partisan issue. It's not an issue of left and right. It's an issue, as all of you know, of right and wrong. And we have the opportunity today to come together and continue the momentum that so many of you have generated to help improve this criminal justice system and help ensure that more Americans have the opportunity to succeed on their own terms, to realize their potential, and to live meaningful and fulfilling lives. And so with that, thank you all for being here, and I'm going to turn things over to my colleague at the Charles Koch Institute, Vikrant Reddy, to lead us in our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Brian. I'm Vikrant Reddy, Senior Fellow at the Charles Koch Institute. Before we get started with today's program, I want to take care of a little bit of housekeeping. On a board behind me, we're experimenting with a new technology today. We have a digital note taker who is going to be capturing some of the main themes and ideas that come out of today's program that get developed. We've never done this kind of thing before, so we want feedback from you guys on whether or not you found it useful. You could find it distracting. You just let us know, and it'll help us with our programming in the future. So, I'm going to get started with an old joke. It's a joke that most of the people in the room have heard. It's the one about the guy who is on the ground underneath the street light searching for his keys. Another guy comes by and he says, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, I'm trying to find my car keys. Can you help me?" He says, "Yeah, I'd be happy to help." So they're on the ground together, they're rooting around, they're desperately trying to find these keys. They can't seem to find them, and the second guy says, "Are you sure you dropped them here under this street light?" And the first guy says, "Oh no, I dropped them across the street, but the light's better over here." That is not what we are here to do today. We are not here to pointlessly investigate easy questions. We're going to take on more challenging questions today. Questions which, if we can develop answers, are actually going to help people, are actually going to help criminal justice in the country. If you are somebody like me who identifies as being right of center, a little conservative, libertarian, and you're interested in criminal justice reform, you've had a pretty good 10 years. Overall, there's been a declining trend in crime, there's been a declining trend in incarceration rates, and things have been going fairly well. But the reward for this is just that the questions get more challenging. And a lot of people who are friends of mine, friends of all of ours who are in senior positions in American government right now are asking harder questions. And they're fair questions. They're saying things like, "Well, Vikrant, you for many years talked to us about what to do about problem marijuana use. I understand that. But now what do we do about problem opioid use?" They're saying things like, "Well, Vikrant, you talked about a lot of strategies for a long time that would help reduce crime in a place like New York City. But moving forward, what do we do about a city like Chicago?" They're saying things like, "Vikrant, for a long time, you talked about rehabilitating nonviolent offenders and helping them re-enter society. But now we're curious about rehabilitating violent offenders, people who may have done something to hurt someone else. How do we help those people re-enter society in a safe and productive way?" These are all fair questions. They're harder questions. They're questions where the light doesn't shine quite so brightly. But we do have some of the top minds in the entire country here today, people who've been thinking about these kinds of issues for decades in many cases. Policymakers, academics, some people who have themselves been incarcerated. And I'm hoping that we can have a wonderful conversation that will shed a bit more light on those topics as we move forward. So we're going to start, I'm very excited to say, with two of the most prominent conservative minds in America. There are a lot of questions right now about where conservatives stand in criminal justice reform and in the criminal justice dialogue. And I was told, because we're on kind of a tight schedule, I shouldn't be reading very lengthy bios, so I won't do that. Everybody knows who Jim DeMint and Mike Lee are. I will simply say that because we want to have a conversation about conservatives in criminal justice, if you were writing a book about conservatism in America over the last 10 years, it would be impossible to write the book without the names of Jim DeMint and Mike Lee, citing them repeatedly. They'd be in the index over and over again. They're two of the most fantastic people in the country to have to talk about an issue like this. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Senator Jim DeMint and Senator Mike Lee.
Sitting to your right, you know.
Thank you, Senators. Let's get started in earnest. As I said, we're on a short timetable. You have to vote, Senator Lee, I assume, today. Well, I'm going to direct the first question to you. I would say you are the leading criminal justice reformer in the U.S. Senate. You're the most passionate person. I'll get an angry call from Rand Paul's office later. But I think it's you. Tell me why you got so passionate about this issue in the first place and what interests you about it.
Part of how I got into this was because as a prosecutor, a federal prosecutor, I saw that there are some ways that our federal criminal justice system works that are ridiculous. They're silly. I remember distinctly the day when one of my colleagues in the U.S. Attorney's Office he came down the hall to talk to me, to tell me about a case he was working on. And that in that case, the federal district judge assigned to the case, a conservative appointed by a Republican president, took the unusual step of issuing an opinion prior to sentencing in that case, disagreeing with the sentence the judge was about to impose. And the opinion went something like this: I, as a federal judge, have to impose sentence in this case. The defendant before me sold 3 small user quantities of marijuana over a 72-hour period. Unbeknownst to the defendant, he was selling to a confidential informant, and the defendant had on his person at the time a firearm, which was neither brandished nor discharged in connection with the offense, but he had a firearm on his person nonetheless. Each of those 3 sales was treated as a separate stackable offense for purposes of what we call the 924C enhancement. And as a result of the fact that he had a gun on his person, these 3 dime bag quantities of marijuana yielded a 55-year minimum mandatory sentence. When I saw that, I thought, this is ridiculous. And so did the judge. Hardly a bleeding heart liberal. This judge was a conservative. But he said, there are rapists, there are hijackers, kidnappers, murderers who do not do that much time in prison. And yet, I'm going to have to put this guy away for 55 years, and I have no discretion to impose any other sentence just because Congress, in its infinite wisdom, has caused this problem. And then he said something that stuck with me. He said, only Congress can fix this problem. And those words were still echoing through my head years later when I got elected to the United States Senate. And that's why I got involved in this effort.
You're talking about Judge Paul Cassell, I assume?
Yes, I am.
From former Judge Paul Cassell, very conservative, Bush appointee, right?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Senator DeMint, I want to ask you now, you have this glittering conservative resume. I mean, you ran the Heritage Foundation, you started the Senate Conservatives Fund, and you also very recently put your name on the Right on Crime Statement of Principles. Mm-hmm. I'm curious about why you feel your conservative outlook and philosophy is consistent with the Right on Crime criminal justice reform mission.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. I appreciate all you folks who are here. To me, the core of conservatism is the dignity of every individual, the value of every life. That's why we talk about individual freedom and self-reliance and personal responsibility. It's why we talk about limited government, because limited government tends to yield more personal freedom. But the value of the individual is key. And in America, we just have entirely too many people in prison. And we know that those things that we care about, certainly personal freedom, but also the opportunity, a lot of that is not only diminished, but sometimes lost for life once people are thrown into prison. And I saw this well before I ever got into politics, just working as a local volunteer, trying to keep young people out of the criminal justice system. All the data showed if this nonviolent offender, many times it was a small drug situation, if they even were sentenced to a few months in prison, oftentimes they came out a hardened criminal. They were not violent before, but they were when they came out. So it was counterproductive to the goals here. So the loss of individuals, the loss of lives, the productivity, and so society loses, families lose, communities, but that individual loses the value of their life. So every conservative should see this as something that they not only care about, but they're passionate about.
Senator Lee, I want to ask you about a really interesting project that your office is working on, the Social Capital Project. I'm wondering, first of all, if you could just define social capital for the audience, and then secondly, if you could talk about how you think that project could feed into larger criminal justice reform ideas. Yeah.
In Congress, we're constantly measuring all kinds of data points that signal the strength of our country in one way or another. Think of gross domestic product, for instance. We track that obsessively. And then we track every other metric relative to that. Percentage of GDP that's going into the tax system, that's going into the revenue of the U.S. Treasury. All these facts and figures that we track don't necessarily measure our health as a country, as a society. Through the Social Capital Project, my role as the Vice Chairman of the Joint Economic Committee, we're trying to track some of the things that really are part and parcel of what it means to be a healthy, thriving society. We want to start to track and measure the health of the American family, of communities, of civil society, churches, synagogues, fraternal orders, charitable foundations, things like that, the extent to which people are connected. What we find is that people, in order to thrive, more than needing access to a government program, they need access to each other. And when our institutions of civil society start to fray, when they become weakened, that's when we see an increase in suicide rates. That's when we start to see an increase in the rate of deaths due to opioid overdoses. And so we're tracking some of these figures and trying to figure out what it is that the federal government might be doing that might be making some of these things worse.
You know, when you talk about social capital in that way and about connections, it inevitably makes me think about the faith community. And in conservative politics in America, the faith community is an incredibly valuable voice. I'm wondering, Senator DeMint, what role you think the faith community has in this dialogue about criminal justice reform?
It's key to recognize that the social capital idea is a good way to wrap it up. But civil society plays a much larger role in public safety,
yeah,
and actually the value of every individual, the things we care about as a country. And the faith is the core of that. It always has been in our country. Faith and freedom, two sides of the same coin. And I think we have seen, as government has grown, that we have seen the faith community play a lesser role. And many times the faith community actually, I know in a lot of the charity groups we were working with, and even working on the juvenile justice system, that the faith community would go away once the government got involved. A lot of it was funding, a lot of it separation of church and state. But without the people with that volunteer spirit, and also understanding that we're more than just flesh and blood, that there's a spiritual component to every human being, and if we leave that out of the equation, which government generally does, we can't solve problems. And we can't understand why our problems are there in the first place. So one of the things I do around the country as a conservative is encourage faith leaders to take more of a leadership role, to speak out on issues like this. And this is one of the issues that can bring the left and right together. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the fun parts about working with it, is see people who I would never be in the same room with recognizing that regardless of your political philosophy, this is something that we can fix together. But a lot of it's going to have to come by decentralizing, and we'll get to that, I'm sure, in the discussion. But the one-size-fits-all solutions in Washington don't work for criminal justice. They don't work for education or health care and a lot of other things we're doing. And we have a system in America where we can have 50 states competing for the best ideas, and we need to let that work a lot more than we're letting it work now, particularly in criminal justice.
Senator Lee, I want to ask you about a kind of a quirky issue, not to freak the crowd out. We're going to use some Latin. There's this concept called mens rea that you talk a lot about and you've gotten really interested in Congress. Can you explain why you're concerned about mens rea standards in the country? Probably define what mens rea is also.
Sure, you bet. For any criminal offense, there is, or properly should be, two factors at play. You have an actus reus, which means the thing itself. You killed someone, you took something, you did something you weren't supposed to do. And the mens rea. The actus reus is the thing you did. The mens rea refers to your state of mind in doing it. If you, imagine you walked out into the hotel lobby here and you pushed an elevator button, and unbeknownst to you, that elevator button resulted in the elevator being released and somebody being injured on the other end. If you didn't know or have any reason to know that by pushing that elevator button, it was going to cause injury to another person, then the law, historically, traditionally, wouldn't treat you as criminally culpable, as criminally liable. If, on the other hand, you knew that by pushing that button you were going to injure someone, and you did it anyway, you did it specifically because it would injure someone, then you would be in trouble criminally. Our modern criminal justice system has at times, especially within our system of federal criminal laws, strayed from this requirement of having a mens rea element. There are several levels at which someone can act. They can act willfully, meaning you intended harm to another person or to property or whatever it was. Knowingly, meaning maybe you didn't necessarily want the harm, but you knew it was going to happen as a result of your actions. Recklessly, meaning you pushed the button and you knew there was at least a pretty good chance that it was going to injure someone, and you pushed it anyway. And negligently, meaning you just weren't paying as much attention as you should have, but you weren't reckless and you didn't know that it was going to cause someone an injury. When our laws fail to take account of these various levels of intent, of scienter, as the law sometimes describes it, we leave people deprived of a form of justice. We leave them deprived of any meaningful opportunity to defend themselves. It has always and should always be a legitimate defense to say, yes, X happened. Yes, I played some role in it, but I had no idea that I was doing that thing. I had no idea that I was causing that harm. A number of our federal laws leave people subject to criminal liability without any requirement that the government show intent. And so I've introduced legislation that would require, as a default standard, if the Congress passes a law that imposes criminal liability and it doesn't state the mens rea requirement, doesn't specify that you have to have acted either willfully or knowingly, intentionally, or recklessly or negligently, for example, then the default standard is set at the highest level, meaning that you acted willfully. That protects the accused, so that the government has to have a higher standard of proof. It has to meet a higher level of production of evidence to show what your intent was.
Let me ask a follow-up question on that. You're talking about laws that are improperly drafted criminal laws, but you could also make the argument that there are just too many laws to begin with. There's an academic named Harvey Silverglate who wrote a book called 3 Felonies a Day, and he suggests that the average American is probably committing 3 federal felonies daily because we've just criminalized so many things. You think that's a fair argument?
I think it's a fair argument. I'm always careful as a lawyer not to dispense with legal advice to a large group of people because everyone's situation is different. I'm sure no one in this crowd is committing 3 felonies a day. And yet, he makes a compelling case for why many people who are engaging in conduct we would regard as perfectly innocent or at least not terribly criminally culpable might be breaking the law. not just by removing the do not remove tag from a mattress or a pillow, but by doing all sorts of things. For example, there's a father and son in Florida who purchased property in Florida's Escambia Bay, and they started to develop that property for residential real estate purposes. And they got all the necessary local permits, they started clearing the land, they started moving dirt around, and pretty soon they ended up on the receiving end of a federal prosecution. They were prosecuted for messing with what turned out to be wetlands, even though the local registries didn't list them as wetlands, even though there were no outward indicators that to them suggested these were wetlands. They had every reason to believe this was suitable for development as residential property. They ended up spending time in prison because they tried to develop this property for a couple of residential buildings. That's wrong. These people clearly had no intent to engage in that, and yet you're exactly right. The more we have a proliferation of criminal law, and the more complicated our federal criminal law becomes, the more people who are going to be swept up in this, especially when we state, when we fail to state the adequate mens rea that's involved in it. In other words, there are several trends that have combined to make this a nasty problem. You've got the over-criminalization of the law in America generally, the over-federalization of criminal law, and you've got the excessive reliance on often excessive minimum mandatory penalties within the federal system. That is a triple whammy, and one that we've got to get away from. One final point on this.
Yeah.
A few years ago, we tried to figure out how many federal criminal offenses there are. The answer that came back to us was chilling. It is unknown, it is unknowable, and it consists at least of hundreds of thousands of separate independent offenses. But what we were told was that it is literally unknowable because there are so many ways, so many different kinds of ways that you can commit a federal criminal offense. That's wrong, and that really has to change.
Senator DeMint, there's a question that's going to be asked 24 times today, and I'm going to give you first crack at it. It's probably the most important criminal justice question in America right now. That's what do we do about the opioid crisis?
Yeah. Well, I don't know, but I know that we can't fix it with a law. It involves a social capital that Senator Lee was talking about, involves a lot of aspects of our civil society. I would certainly like to see folks who are performers, athletes, actors, prominent people in the media joining together to help people become more aware of the dangers here. And I think that's part of the problem of people often get into this not knowing the dangers of particularly using legal drugs or misusing legal drugs. So knowing the dangers of it is really important. The fabric of our civil society is key. We mentioned the faith community. A lot of times people have addictions or drug problems because they're trying to fill an empty spiritual void. Yeah. And so there are a lot of aspects to this that we really have to come together. First of all, recognize it's a terrible problem. I think you also have some of the large pharmaceutical companies, the drug companies, who could do a lot more than they're doing now. And I think and people need to do as much of this as possible voluntarily, because when we try to solve problems here in Washington with some new law, the unintended consequences seem to always outstrip the benefits. Right. But that doesn't mean Congress doesn't have a role, but it's certainly a very sad problem, and it gets back to where I started. The value of every human life here is in jeopardy when that happens. So we need to take it seriously, but a lot of the folks who are complaining in other areas of our lives, the high-profile stars, need to help young people know that this is not recreational. It is very dangerous.
Senator Lee, do you have any thoughts on how we tackle opioid abuse and overdoses?
Some of this is happening naturally and organically as people in their communities and in their families know more and more people who have died from it. I mean, it's these days in America, I find that in any given room, I can find someone who has lost a loved one, either a close friend or a relative or someone in their community, to an opioid overdose death. I also find that in many instances, the abuse underlying what led to that death started out as completely legitimate use. Started out as somebody who was recovering from an accident or surgery or something, and they were prescribed something, and that something they became dependent upon, and it ended up leading to their death. The more we become aware of that, I think prescribing patterns are going to change, and I think demand from consumers, from patients, is going to change. I also hope and expect that in the coming years you'll see a lot of development within the pharmaceutical industry to try to find new treatments, new ways of dealing with pain that don't rely on opiates or opioids. And I would welcome that development as well.
Let me ask you another question about drug policy in the United States. There are a lot of states right now that are experimenting with decriminalization of marijuana. And whatever anybody thinks of that, the reality is that it is still a banned substance under federal law. So these states are in defiance of federal law, and I think a lot of people are wondering whether or not the federal government should step in and do something about that. What are your thoughts?
This is a very interesting case. Corey Gardner from Colorado is across the hall from me in the Senate Russell office building. Colorado has, of course, legalized marijuana. I serve Jell-O in my office every Wednesday at 3:30. Jell-O's Utah's official state snack for reasons that aren't entirely clear. And I've asked Corey whether he serves brownies every Wednesday, and he's never quite latched on to that idea. Something interesting happened, though, in 2009 when the Obama administration announced that it would not enforce federal marijuana laws criminalizing the possession and use of marijuana, at least in the case of bare, non-commercial possession and use within a state whose laws accept the legitimacy of marijuana. And I thought when this policy was announced, it was curious. On the one hand, I welcome steps toward federalism. We've gotten too far from the founding era understanding that most laws are state and local laws. Most of what determines the legality of our behavior from one day or another ought to be decided on a state and local level rather than on a national level. And certainly, if you regard this as a potential treatment, a treatment that can be planted, produced, distributed, and consumed entirely within a sovereign state's boundaries, that is something that, as a matter of first principles, perhaps ought to be subject to state and local regulation rather than federal regulation. We've deviated so badly from all these principles that it's surprising that we've got sort of a beachhead of federalism within this area. But I do think that is probably the right approach as a matter of constitutional first principles. I don't know where it will lead as a matter of public policy. I'm not an expert on this issue, and I've got friends on both sides of the issue who say, yes, marijuana is a great treatment for all kinds of things, and others who say, no, it's not. I'm agnostic as to that point, but I do think both as a matter of practical reality, with as many states going as far as they now have, and as a matter of constitutional first principles, it makes some sense for states to be able to decide this issue for themselves.
Senator DeMint, I want to ask you something about a poll that we commissioned in conjunction with this event today. We got some results from the poll that are not going to surprise you. They're depressing, though. The poll was basically about police-community relationships in the United States. And what we found is that, broadly speaking, people have faith in their local police. They have confidence and they trust police officers. But there are some pockets of this country, often these are minority neighborhoods, where trust is eroded dramatically. Mm-hmm. And these individuals just do not have trust. They don't have confidence in local law enforcement. What do we do to overcome that trust problem?
A tough issue, and building trust is difficult in a lot of situations. Yeah. But I think the leadership, and again, I don't want to get into partisan politics here, but unfortunately over the last decade, almost every incident that's happened in poor minority communities have been by people at the national level. It's been blamed on some form of racism or something other than good law enforcement. And certainly some of that could have been the case, but leaders have to stand above that. And I think we have created a problem there from the political side that needs to be fixed from the political side. But obviously, locally at the level, there are a lot of police forces, policemen are trying to build that trust, communities that are coming together, and everything we've talked about, from the faith community to national leaders saying the right things and just trying to dispel or at least diminish some of the heightened tension so that some of this coming together can happen. But so you need local, state, national governments involved. You need the faith community, the local volunteer community, but we need people again, speaking truth and encouraging people to work together and not continue this effort to divide people along lines that sometimes don't really even exist.
You know, Senator Lee, it occurs to me that part of the trust problem is a result of the way things spread like wildfire on social media and 24-hour cable news. Is there anything that can be done about that problem? I mean, people have First Amendment right to post what they want, obviously.
They do. I really hope that governments don't ever respond to this by saying, okay, what we need to do now is to control what people say on social media. I think that would be very dangerous. Talk about things that spread like wildfire. Once a government gets a taste of the power rush that goes from suppressing speech that the government finds distasteful or uncomfortable, that quickly leads to bad places. It ends in tears and worse. So I hope we never go to that place. The First Amendment is something that we've revered in this country, and I hope it's something we always will revere.
You know, we've talked a lot about some fundamental conservative principles this morning. I want to ask you, Senator Lee, do you think that civil asset forfeiture policies are consistent with conservative first principles?
Generally speaking, no. No. I mean, look, it's horrifying what the government can do. Yeah. If the government takes a look at your car and concludes somehow that your car has been involved in criminal activity, they can just come and take your car. They seize it. It's deemed forfeited by virtue of their conclusion that your car was involved in criminal activity. Then the burden is on you to prove that you didn't do it, that your car wasn't involved in criminal activity, that it wasn't purchased with the proceeds of ill-gotten gains. This shifts the burden of proof from the government, which bears that burden when it's accusing you of a crime, over to you, so that you have to prove that you're innocent. Now, this is wrong. This violates all kinds of principles of due process that we hold near and dear in this country. So I think it's a big problem. It is also a problem that I think is starting to get some recognition. A few months ago, Justice Thomas issued a statement in connection with the denial of certiorari in a case coming out of Texas, in which he acknowledged what some of these problems are. I think they need to be dealt with. I find it amusing that the Department of Justice recently appointed an accountability officer to oversee the use of civil asset forfeiture proceedings. Well, if everything's just fine, and if this is an effort the Department of Justice has just recently expanded, but they're acknowledging that there are problems such that they need to have an internal nanny to oversee what's going on, those send very different signals. Another thing that I think we need to be worried about is that on a state and local level, there have been a lot of efforts and a lot of laws passed. A lot of state laws now restrict the use of civil asset forfeiture because people have seen the potential for abuse. And so in some states, state law enforcement authorities will get around this by going and joining up with federal law enforcement personnel.
Equitable sharing.
Equitable sharing. And they have federal civil asset forfeiture proceedings brought instead of state proceedings. Those are handled in federal court rather than state court, managed by federal law rather than state law. Yeah. And because the federal law on the books is less restrictive than many of these state laws, they'll use the federal government. The federal government gets a cut of it, but the state government also gets some of it.
Yeah.
We'd call that money laundering elsewhere, and it really worries me.
Yeah, and that's a perverse incentive to have in the first place. One of the primary reasons for government is to protect property rights, and this asset forfeiture turns it on its head, and there's no due process when it happens. So everything about justice is kind of turned on its head. The principle of this thing. And I'm certain there are cases where it is legitimate, but the government, as Mike said, needs to prove that, and you can't throw that on the individual.
Right.
So it's a problem we need to fix.
Senator DeMint, I want to ask you a little bit. We talked about the role of the faith community in this dialogue. What about the role of the business community? That's also a really important part of kind of the conservative constellation in America. And we know just from basic research that the most important factor in making sure somebody re-enters society successfully is whether or not they've got stable employment.
Yeah.
So what's the role of the business community in these conversations?
Well, like you said, employment's key. If someone has been in the penal system and gets out without a job, the chances of them being back are pretty high. And I don't think the answer is to hide the records of folks and not allow businesses to check backgrounds. I know from having a small business for years, I mean, there's a great volunteer business community. And if with some assistance from, again, the government itself, I know there would a lot of people, a lot of businesses like to help people get back on their feet. If we can set up a good system for that to happen, particularly for nonviolent folks. And so I think that you would find a lot of volunteer support from the business community who would hire people who have a record, and then hopefully at some point those records could be cleared up and that the individual, again, with nonviolent, particularly the smaller offenses, could get a clear record and move ahead. But again, I've been in the business community many years, and I know a lot of us work together on this issue and would come together and help people get back on their feet.
Senator Lee, are you familiar with these ban-the-box proposals and policies? What do you think of these ban-the-box proposals? I
think if employers decide they want to do that, that's not only their right, but I think that's a laudable endeavor.
Yeah.
I don't see myself being very comfortable with government mandating that other people do it. I think it needs to be up to each employer based on how they decide they want to engage in their hiring process.
Sure. So, Senator Lee, one question I want to ask you is we've been talking all morning about finding ways to reduce incarceration. Is it possible to reduce incarceration and reduce crime simultaneously?
I think so. Look, there are all kinds of things that affect a crime rate. We've seen communities where crime and incarceration have gone down simultaneously. New York City has, in recent memory, been able to achieve some of that, but there are lots and lots of other less prominent, smaller communities where that has happened. Some of this really is tied to how a community is doing economically and in every other way, how families are doing, how communities come together, whether they're coming together through churches, through synagogues, through other religious activities, charitable foundations and so forth. If they are, people are a whole lot less likely to engage in criminal activity. So we need not view incarceration and crime reduction as being sort of dependent upon each other. In other words, there are ways to reduce crime that don't necessarily involve increasing the total number of people incarcerated at any given time or the percentage of your population incarcerated at any given time. In fact, there is some logic to the contrary of that. Some of what we do when we incarcerate people for too long and we put too many people in there is that we make recidivists out of them. And that's unfortunate. We don't ever want to see that.
So, Senator DeMint, there are people, friends of ours, in fact, who will say, okay, this is all well and good, everything you guys have been talking about, but in fairness, this is the argument they would make. You guys sound a little soft on crime, and you're not being responsive to the needs of victims in this whole dialogue. What would you say in response to that?
I think particularly at a lower level of, again, nonviolent crimes, the punishment can be directed towards restitution and other ways to make a victim whole, particularly, again, when it has been nonviolent. And so you've got to obviously keep the victims in mind. Again, the role of government is public safety here. But as a conservative, the cost effectiveness of taking someone with a minor offense and putting them in a penal system where the costs are high, the chances of them being hardened as a criminal, the cost to society over time, we have to think about that.
Sure.
And it's not good for the individual either. So those who would say we should have harsh punishment have probably not been through the situation where they had a child or a good friend or someone who got caught up in a system, maybe inadvertently or maybe just, again, just got off track. Their whole life should not be destroyed because of that. And that's certainly what I'll continue to argue here is we can make the victims whole. And as a matter of fact, I think it would help the criminal here to get engaged in the process of working for their community and in some way to provide restitution for those that they've done wrong to.
Yeah. Senator Lee, what's your response to the soft on crime, soft on victims' rights argument?
Yeah, it's absurd. It is an absurd and a lazy argument to say that anyone who believes that we need to reform our criminal justice system is soft on crime. It's also just wrong, objectively speaking. So take, for example, the legislation that I've been pushing in the Senate for the last few years, the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act. We are looking at ways to identify almost entirely low-level, nonviolent drug offenses. I understand the argument that says all drug offenses are violent offenses. In a sense, that's true. They all contribute to that. But some of them are, by their nature, not themselves violent. The criminal act itself doesn't involve violence. In some of those cases, it makes sense from time to time for us to review the minimum mandatory sentencing levels. This has the potential to make us more effective in the way that we fight crime. We have resources for fighting crime, for promoting public safety, that are one way or another finite. And as a larger and larger share of that pie has to go toward incarceration, it takes resources away from policing efforts and other efforts in which our government could be engaged to actually promote public safety. So if you want no change at all, you might actually be threatening more harm and inhibiting things that could make the public safer. We are tough on crime in this country. There's no question about that. And no one in this effort is really talking about changing that. What we are saying is let's be smart in the way we go about it so that it's always directed toward public safety.
Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit later today about this new project that we're supporting at the Charles Koch Institute. It's called Academy for Justice, and like I said, we'll talk a bit more about it at lunch today. But basically, a bunch of really prominent criminal justice academics have gotten together and put together this book, and each one has written a different chapter on a different facet of the criminal justice system. When we first started on this project, the biggest goal was don't write in terms of jargon, find a way to make this useful to policymakers. I want to ask you, since you're in the fight right now, how can a product like this be useful to you? What can we do to make that useful for your work?
Facts and figures are always helpful. Help people, including us as lawmakers, understand as many of the facts as you can get your hands on about the number of crimes being prosecuted each year and in each category, about how people are being sentenced, about the differentials between state sentences and federal sentences, about the relative rates of recidivism in different systems. All of these things are variables that we can look at, and they can all be very helpful. It's also an area in which there is a dearth of information because until fairly recently there hasn't been a whole lot of public attention brought to bear on this. When I first was elected to the Senate in 2010 and I arrived in 2011, again with the words of Judge Paul Cassell still echoing in my mind, only Congress can fix this problem. it was a little intimidating at first because there just weren't that many people interested in addressing the issue. It hasn't, until fairly recently, been perceived as sexy. But fortunately, in the last few years, it's become exciting. It's become popular. But we've got to catch up in terms of educating ourselves and the public about all these details.
Yeah. Senator DeMint, you're starting a new initiative, and I want to know just a little bit about it and how a product like this book could be useful for that endeavor.
Well, our new group here in D.C., the Conservative Partnership Institute, is really designed to help people like Mike Lee on the inside. We're not going to come and tell Mike what the policy should be, but what we've found over time is we've elected a lot of good people, but the structure of the system here in D.C. is very punishing to people who are trying to do the right thing. We're trying to convene staff and members, develop consensus. Consensus is what gives you leverage to get things done. On an issue like this, where there are probably a lot of different ideas in the conservative community, if we're going to actually make a difference, we're going to have to get on the same page, eventually get behind the same legislation, and actually get something done. Yeah. And so we just want to play a role as a support system for those who really believe in these principles, the value of the individual, the limited government, and freedom. And I'd like to end by just saying one thing, that whether we're conservative or liberal or progressive, whatever we call ourselves here, if we're really going to help the country, unite the country, we're going to have to get used to the idea is the way Congress can solve many of the problems is let things go. And we have a great federal system in the country where we have 50 states that have the opportunity to create the best ideas on how to educate children, how to deal with health care. Not that states can't work together, but once we try to do something in Washington with a one-size-fits-all solution, regardless of all the good intentions, and certainly we can see this in criminal justice, and it's been the fault of conservatives and liberals, everyone wanting to do something, and if the result of this effort here is that Congress is going to pass some law, again, force various types of things on states, it's likely to come out just as badly. Yeah. So the idea that states can come forward and propose, and it may not suit me that they want to propose decriminalizing various kinds of drug use. But the principle, the first principle here, let states do what they can do. Let them make proposals to the federal government of how they're going to deal with these crimes to make sure that victims are taken care of and public safety. But states have a vested interest in doing this right. So I know, for one, I've got to get used to this idea that it really appealed to me probably 15 or 20 years ago, the idea of mandatory sentences and not let some of these crazy judges let people back out on the street. We can't do it perfectly, but I know that we have a better shot if we have states trying to solve their own problem here. And what would happen is they would try to keep people out of the criminal justice system. That doesn't mean they would not be punished or that they would not provide restitution or community service or various types of apprenticeships with businesses to get a profession. There are a lot of things that can happen, but the overlay of federal mandates keep a lot of that from happening. And so we have an opportunity to solve the problem, but the way Congress can solve it is likely going to be to get the federal government out of various aspects of the punishments and crimes.
You know, Senator Lee, partisanship has been pretty intense in the country for quite a few years, but on criminal justice, there's been a lot of good cooperation for several years now, especially at the state level. Things have worked pretty well. I'm just curious about what you're seeing. Is that still happening? Is that cooperation still out there?
Yes. Yeah. This has been a real bright spot.
Yeah.
In an otherwise arid desert, this has been an oasis where Democrats and Republicans can come together. We've had a lot of bipartisan support for our efforts. When the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act came through the Senate Judiciary Committee, on which I serve, in the last Congress, it passed out by a bipartisan supermajority vote of 15-5. And there's corresponding bipartisanship on comparable effort going on in the House of Representatives. As far as I can tell, in each of the state legislatures where this is being addressed, that's also a bipartisan issue. So we have yet to politicize this one. I hope that we can prevent it from becoming politicized. By politicized, I mean made excessively partisan. There's no reason why this has to be an issue that's uniquely, distinctively either Democratic or Republican or liberal or conservative. This is just a matter of common sense and of sound public policy.
Yeah. Well, let me ask this question. We've got a lot of friends, I've said this a few times today, we've got a lot of friends who disagree with us on this issue. They're friends, they're conservatives, and they've got senior positions in American government right now, and they make fair arguments, but at the end of the day, we have a disagreement, and what I want to know is what arguments we can make to try and persuade them, and I mean persuade fellow conservatives on this. Any thoughts?
The best thing that we can do, I think, is be ever vigilant to detect and combat in all of its forms the argument that says you just want to be soft on crime.
Yeah.
30 years ago, this argument took on an enormous amount of emotional appeal, and it swept through our country. Some would say, even today with good reason, many people who are now part of our movement were part of that then and insist that that one then was justified, but that it carried on too far. But regardless, we've got to be prepared to confront this argument. This is soft on crime. It's not. Mm-hmm. Look, these are federal sentencing laws. Were not handed down from Mount Sinai on stone tablets.
Right.
These have been human creations. They evolve over time. They change. Our criminal justice system itself has changed dramatically since, for example, the colonial era. In the colonial era in America, our criminal justice system was entirely different. Incarceration was something that happened primarily, if not almost exclusively, in the pretrial custody context. Mm-hmm. You were held as a criminal defendant in jail pending your trial. Your trial was carried out, and you were either acquitted, in which case you were released, or you were convicted, in which case your sentence was carried out. Sometimes that sentence was something that we don't do anymore, is some type of public shaming or the infliction of what we might today call corporal punishment. Other times it involved capital punishment. But it was carried out, and then the thing was over. Mm-hmm. This lengthy, lifetime, multi-decade-long incarceration wasn't really a thing in America back then. Now, I'm not saying we can or necessarily should go back to that, but what I'm saying is these things do change. They ought to change over time as the needs of society change, and we ought to be willing to question the status quo, because the status quo is far from perfect.
That's right where I want to jump in, because anyone who's a critic of what we're trying to do here, we just have to ask them, okay, what we're doing now is not working. What is your solution? And it's not working. I think we have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, and this is supposed to be a land of opportunity and freedom. We know that it just destroys the lives of individuals, the families around them. It takes a productive citizen and makes them a cost to the taxpayer. So from a compassion side, from a cost side, there's no aspect of what's happening now that we could say is working. Yeah. And so if for the folks who are critics, let's hear their ideas. But for the most part, we see in little small areas where local areas, volunteers, states, they've done some things that have shown good success. The faith community, what Chuck Colson did, we have seen that you could help folks who are in and make sure they get out and stay out. But these things are not allowed to flourish and scale up as long as we have the overlay of federal mandates and just the gray area that makes it hard for things to happen. And so we need to begin to devolve the authority here back where it belongs. And federal crimes need to be high crimes. Mm-hmm. And again, states have to be responsible. They have every incentive to be more responsible than we do here in Washington. So I'm glad to take on the critics here, love to hear their ideas. But what we're doing is not working, and it hadn't been working for a long time. Yeah. And it's time to get serious about fixing it.
Senator Lee, I want to follow up on something you said that I thought was interesting. You're talking about this colonial world where you would have the punishment, it'd be over with quickly, and then everybody kind of lets you get on with your life again.
Unless you were dead at that point, and then then that
That's
didn't happen.
it's a different situation. I wonder how we get back to a world like that. I don't know if that's a government solution. It's just people needing more empathy rather than hanging a scarlet letter around your neck for decades because, they whisper, oh, well, that guy, he was in prison. I mean, how do we fix that problem?
Yeah, I don't know, and again, to be clear, I'm not advocating that we go back to
No,
the
sure. Back to
colonial
whipping
era
their
justice
stocks.
system. I don't think that would work, but
Yeah.
I do think communities have a lot to do with it.
Yeah.
The more people are connected to each other through families and through institutions of civil society, the more they're going to have the support to refrain from engaging in more criminal activity, the more they're going to have the education and the encouragement to do more positive, productive things with their lives in the first place and not engage in that criminal activity. I think there is an unmistakable connection. There is certainly a correlation, and I think most people would agree there is a strong causal relationship between the deterioration of the family over the last few decades and the rise in certain types of crime.
Sure.
And I think we have to look at what policies. The problem with all of this is, they say when you're holding a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail.
Yeah.
There are some problems that, by their very nature, government is not well equipped to fix. But the tragedy is, government, while it can't rekindle the fire of civil society, it can't create families or churches or most other types of civil society. It just can't. It's not within its capacity. It can weaken them. Mm-hmm. And once it destroys them, there's no telling what will happen, how those things can be brought back. So that's why through the Social Capital Project and elsewhere, I'm always scanning the horizon to look for areas in which the government might unwittingly, perhaps with the best of intentions at the outset, be weakening the fabric of our civil society. To the extent we are, wherever we are, we've got to get out and we've got to stop doing that.
Yeah, we know there are many perverse incentives in our welfare program for marriage, and we know that the chances of a child ended up in prison are greatly enhanced if they're raised in a family that's without a mom and dad. And I know that's not politically correct to say today, but the government can't make that happen. But as Mike just said, they can weaken the fabric of our society. They can displace the role of civil society and the faith community. And we need to reevaluate that in light of criminal justice reform, because there are a lot of other factors feeding into this problem that make it hard for civil society to deal with someone who has become dysfunctional because the social fabric around them has just frayed. So this is a big picture, and I think the bottom line of this is despite all the good intentions here, we can't build civil society from Washington, and we need to make sure we're not destroying it. And on this particular issue, we need to realize that there are a lot of solutions that could be found at the local and state level, and we need to do what we can to devolve these things, decriminalize some of take the federal component out of it, as the senator said. And we have the solutions in front of us, and I think what that Senator Lee is proposing now would begin that process. It would show that you could get bipartisan support to solve this problem, and then we could go from there to, I think, take more things and send them back to the states.
Yeah, building civil society is so hard, but destroying it is so easy.
Yeah.
It reminds me of this joke I heard. I grew up in Texas. We had an old politician named Sam Rayburn, and he said, it's really hard to build a barn. It takes lumber, it takes resources. You have to get people together. It takes a lot of time. But any donkey, he used a different word, any donkey can come and kick it down in 2 or 3 minutes. And it's true that in civil society is kind of the same way.
Yeah.
Well, we've only got 2 minutes left, so I want to ask you, it's probably the key question of the panel. We titled it Turning Ideas into Action. So moving forward, first you, Senator Lee, how do we turn all the ideas we talked about today into action?
We passed the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act. This needs to happen. We've had a lot of talk, we've had a lot of effort, a lot of research that's been done. This bill needs to move through the Senate and the House of Representatives. It needs to be passed by both houses and submitted to the President. This is something that, had it come up for a vote in the last Congress, would have received, I think, at least 70 votes, probably more. If it came up for a vote in the Senate today, I think it would receive at least 70 votes, probably more. This could be a big bipartisan win for an administration that is trying to make a difference. And so I encourage your senators, your congressmen, encourage anyone you know at the White House to help us advance this, help us get it to the Senate floor for a vote so that we can pass it.
I am obligated to note that we are a 501c3 at the Charles Koch Institute and take no position on legislation. With Senator DeMint.
You know, we have federal programs where we've allowed states to apply for waivers in education or whatever, where they bring their solution to displace what the federal government is doing. In the case of criminal justice, I'd like to see us explore how we could begin to take the federal crime and punishment out of various low levels of crime, with states proposing how they're going to deal with it. And again, I think that we can do this on a very thoughtful, systematic way. But we need to move to a federalism model here, and keeping more serious crimes to be very limited and knowable at the federal level.
Well, we finished 9 seconds early. So, ladies and gentlemen, please thank our two guests today, Senator Jim DeMint and Senator Mike Lee.